The Marxist position on women's inequality is outlined by both Marx and Engels. Engels is lesser known than Marx, but he contributed a lot to Marxist theory, particularly in relation to the family and women's position in the family. As usual, the Marxist view is economically deterministic. That is, the Marxists argue that women's inequality stems from the economy alone and ignores other factors such as patriarchy in the creation of women's inequality. Engels believed that economic factors caused women's subservience to men, and only economic changes could lead to their liberation or freedom. He stated that the dominance of men in marriage was due to his economic dominance. He was more likely to be the breadwinner, and therefore women relied on men and were subservient to men. Therefore, when the man no longer has economic dominance, he will no longer have power over the family and women will become more equal. It was believed that men enjoyed greater power in the family because men owned the means of production, or worked for the means of production, and at least earned a wage. Marx and Engels believed that capitalism would eventually lead to some reduction in inequalities between men and women. They argued that the demand for female wage labour would raise the status and power of proletarian women in the family. Female employment would free women from economic dependence and from male dominance. This is true to a certain extent. As capitalism has become more complex, we've seen the rise of the service sector and women have entered the labour force in increasing numbers. However, whilst it has led to more equality, it hasn't led to increasing equality of any great significance. So some Marxist feminists have argued that it has not led to the changes Marx and Engels predicted. However, Marx and Engels argued that it was really a communist revolution that would lead to real equality for women. So although women continue to be financially disadvantaged compared to men, this doesn't totally refute the Marxist theory. Engels claimed that a communist society would eradicate gender divisions completely because the means of production would be communally owned. And because the means of production would be communally owned, the state would be responsible for providing childcare. This would free women up from the home and the burdens of looking after a family. However, in countries which have become communist, this has not actually occurred. The state does not always provide childcare, and women are still highly unequal in many communist societies. Feminists, particularly radical feminists, have criticised the Marxist theory for being economically deterministic, and they see patriarchy as a separate system which is completely separate to the economy. So radical feminists would argue that a communist society would still be patriarchal and therefore there would still be clear gender differences. Marxist feminism is also economically deterministic, and similar criticisms can be applied to Marxist feminism as can be applied to Marxism. Some Marxist feminists have argued that women's position in society benefits capitalism. Margaret Benston argues that women act as a reserve army of labour. We've come across this term before when looking at the underclass and when looking at the working class. So it can be argued from a Marxist perspective that the working class acts as a reserve army of labour, and so do the underclass. The reserve army of labour allows capitalists to keep wages down and keep profits up. In their role as secondary breadwinner, married women provide a source of cheap and easily exploitable labour. It is argued that there are clear socialisation differences, which mean that women are socialised to comply and submit, and as such they form a more docile labour force, which can be readily manipulated and easily fired when not required. In periods of high unemployment, then, women are not needed in the workplace anymore, and it is argued they are the first to lose their jobs and sent back to the home. Indeed, this has been evident in the recent recession, where women have been losing their jobs at a faster rate than men. However, because capitalism is characterized by booms and slumps, the women stay in reserve, waiting. And after a recession, there's inevitably a boom. So we have periods of high employment where women are needed to come back into the workplace from the family. And then when there's another recession, women will be more likely to be fired. This is why they are called a reserve army of labour, is this idea that they are waiting in reserve. But they also help the capitalist system because they reduce the bargaining power of male workers. So as long as there's a reserve army of labour who are prepared to go into the workplace and work for low pay, that means that men will also receive a low pay, and their protests and strikes will have very little effect. It is also argued that due to the socialisation differences, compared to male workers, women are less likely to go on strike or take action against employers. When women join unions, they also find themselves in male-dominated organisations. So sexist ideology splits the working class along sex lines, and it's this idea of divide and rule. It makes it easier to control the working class. This division between working class men and working class women further prevents a revolution from occurring. So we're now going to look at the radical feminist perspective. As already mentioned, the radical feminists disagree with Marxism and Marxist feminists because they see patriarchy as a structure in society which is separate to the economy. So women, to gain equality, need to separate themselves from male control, and that cannot be done through a communist revolution alone. So radical feminists focus on patriarchy as the key cause of women's inequality, although most feminists actually touch on this in some way. Radical feminists see society as patriarchal. It is dominated and ruled by men. Men are seen as the ruling class, and women are seen as the subject class. The family is seen by some radical feminists as the key institution which is responsible for oppressing women. Radical feminists believe that women have always been exploited, and that only revolutionary change can offer the possibility of their liberation. However, radical feminists do not argue for a communist revolution. They argue for a feminist revolution where women take over the means of production and where women start to control society. It is important to remember there are different shades of radical feminism. Some radical feminists believe a feminist revolution is important and seek for female supremacy, which would be replacing patriarchy with matriarchy. However, other radical feminists just want merely equality. So the first radical feminist that we're going to be looking at is Wolby. Wolby argues that there are three elements to patriarchy, and this is why Wolby's theory is called triple systems theory. The first element of patriarchy is subordination. Institutions such as the family, media, and education produce unequal relations between men and women. So women are subordinate to men. They are seen as underneath men. The second element is oppression. Women experience sexism because men discriminate against them on the basis of unfounded stereotypes or ideology. And the third element is exploitation. Men exploit or use women's skills and labour without rewarding them sufficiently. For example, women are exploited in terms of housework. They complete housework, but they're not paid for their contributions. Patriarchy overlaps with capitalism and racism to produce gender stratification. So Wolby, while she is a radical feminist, she doesn't ignore the influence of the economy. So she argues the 6 structures which restrict women and maintain male domination. These are paid work. For example, women experience horizontal and vertical segregation, some of the evidence of which I discussed earlier in this screencast. Patriarchal relations within the household is the second structure. Female labour is exploited within the family. This is very much a Marxist feminist idea as well as a radical feminist idea. It's this idea that women perform free labour for a capitalist society. Thirdly, patriarchal culture. Institutions such as the mass media represent women in narrow social roles such as sex objects and mother housewives. Fourthly, there is sexuality. There's a double standard which values multiple sexual partners for men but condemns the same behaviour in women. The fifth structure is male violence towards women. Men use violence or the threat of violence, and that helps to keep women in their place and discourages them from challenging patriarchy. And then finally, the sixth structure is the state. This acts in the interest of men rather than women in terms of welfare rules and the weaknesses of laws protecting women at work. Another example could be the idea that maternity leave is paid to women. Wolby also argues that trade unions are patriarchal institutions and they're dominated by men and usually act in the interests of men. Women have made some gains in the union movement in recent years, and they have had some success in persuading unions to take gender equality more seriously. From a study of engineering, clerical work and textiles in Britain, she claims that 2 strategies have been used by males in these industries: the exclusion of women altogether or the confinement of women to lower grades of work.